The North Sea doesn't forgive in winter. January 1946. The war had been over for 8 months, but the coastline of Denmark still held its breath. Beneath the grey, churning waters off Esbjerg, thousands of German mines waited, silent, patient, deadly. They didn't care that Hitler was dead or that Berlin had fallen. They were anchored to the seabed with thick chains, swaying with the current like iron flowers in a garden of death. Henrik Mortensen stood at the end of the wooden pier, watching the waves slap against the pylons. 53 years old. Weathered face carved by salt and wind. Hands like gnarled oak roots. He'd been fishing these waters for 37 years, knew every channel, every sandbar, every current. But now his boat sat idle. The Stina Marie, named after his late wife, hadn't left harbor in 4 months. Nobody was fishing. The mines had seen to that. Behind him, the town of Esbjerg looked like a corpse. Windows dark. Streets empty. The cannery, once the beating heart of the harbor, stood silent, its smokestacks cold. 12 fishing boats had tried to return to the old routes. 7 had made it back. 5 hadn't. The explosions could be heard from shore, a dull whump that carried across the water, followed by silence. Then pieces of wood floating back. Sometimes a body. Henrik pulled his wool coat tighter against the wind. The cold bit through to his bones, but he barely felt it. He was thinking about the map in his pocket, the one he'd stolen from the British demoning office 3 weeks ago. The Allies had promised to clear the mines. British Royal Navy ships had been working methodically, using minesweepers with magnetic and acoustic triggers. But there were too many mines and too few ships. At the current rate, the Danish coast wouldn't be safe for another 3 years. Maybe 5. 3 years without fishing meant starvation for Esbjerg. Henrik couldn't wait 3 years. His daughter Astrid and her 2 children were living on boiled potatoes and whatever charity the church could spare. The whole town was dying slowly, watching the sea that had fed them for generations become a killing field. He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled cigarette. His last one. He lit it with shaking hands, not from cold, but from the thought that had been growing in his mind for weeks. The thought that had kept him awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Astrid's children cry from hunger in the next room. The mines were magnetic contact mines. Haftmannen. He'd learned this from talking to a drunk British lieutenant at the harbor pub. Steel casings packed with explosives, triggered when a metal hull passed close enough to complete a magnetic circuit. The Germans had scattered them by the hundreds during their retreat, one last fuck you to the Danes who'd been occupied for 5 years. But magnetic meant they could be triggered without a boat. Henrik took a long drag on his cigarette and looked out at the Stina Marie. Then he looked at the workshop behind the cannery, the place where they'd once repaired winches and engines. Inside that workshop, he'd been building something. Working at night, in secret, using scrap metal and wire and salvaged batteries from abandoned German bunkers. A magnetic sweep rig. Illegal as hell. The British had been very clear. Civilian demoning operations were strictly prohibited. Penalty was imprisonment, possibly execution if they suspected sabotage. Only military personnel with proper training could handle mines. Henrik understood the reasoning. Amateurs would get themselves killed, might accidentally detonate mines in shipping channels, might cause diplomatic incidents. But Henrik also understood that his grandchildren were eating once a day. He flicked the cigarette into the water and watched it disappear into the gray foam. The wind picked up, howling through the empty pier. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The sound echoed off the silent buildings. Henrik had served in the Danish merchant marine in his youth. He'd seen action in the First World War, survived a torpedo attack in 1917 that had killed 18 of his crewmates. He understood risk. He understood explosives. And he understood that sometimes waiting for permission meant dying. The rig was almost ready. Another week of work, maybe less. He'd constructed it from a simple principle. powerful electromagnets mounted on a wooden frame, towed behind a small rowboat at a safe distance. The magnets would pull the mines toward them, trigger the detonators, and, theoretically, explode them far enough away that the rowboat would survive the blast. Theoretically. The problem was testing. He couldn't exactly practice in the harbor. The first time he deployed the rig would be the real thing. Live mines. Live explosives. One mistake and he'd be scattered across the North Sea in pieces too small to identify. Henrik turned and walked back down the pier. His boots made hollow sounds on the old wood. As he passed the harbormaster's office, he saw the notice still pinned to the door. Danger, mine-infested waters, all fishing prohibited until further notice. He kept walking. At the workshop, he unlocked the side door and slipped inside. The space smelled of rust and grease and old rope. In the corner, covered by a canvas tarp, sat his creation. He pulled the tarp back and stared at it in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. The magnetic rig looked crude but purposeful. 2 salvaged German electromagnets, each weighing about 40 pounds, mounted on a reinforced wooden crossbeam. Copper wiring snaked between them, connecting to a car battery he'd bartered for with his watch. The whole assembly was designed to be towed behind a small dinghy on a 100-foot rope. When the battery was engaged, the magnets would activate, creating a powerful magnetic field. Strong enough to trigger a mine. Strong enough to die. Henrik ran his hand along the rough wood. His fingers found the inscription he'd carved the night before. In a moment of sentiment he immediately regretted. For Astrid. He heard footsteps outside. Henrik quickly threw the tarp back over the rig and moved to the workbench, pretending to sort through fishing tackle. The door creaked open. Lars Nielsen stepped inside, another fisherman, younger, maybe 35. Lars had lost his brother to a mine in October. "Henrik," Lars said quietly, "I know what you're building." Henrik didn't turn around. "Don't know what you're talking about. I saw you 3 nights ago, working on the magnets." Silence. Lars stepped closer. "I want to help." Henrik finally turned. Lars's face was gaunt, hollow-eyed. The whole town looked like that now. "It's suicide," Henrik said flatly. "Even if it works, the British will arrest me. Might shoot me. Then we'll both get shot." Lars's voice didn't waver. "My kids are eating seaweed and fish bones, Henrik. My wife cries herself to sleep every night. I'm not waiting 3 years for the fucking British to maybe clear these waters." Henrik studied the younger man's face. Saw determination. Saw desperation. Saw the same hunger that had been gnawing at his own gut. "We go out before dawn," Henrik said. "Day after tomorrow. Tell no one. Not your wife. Not the pastor. No one." Lars nodded. "What do I bring?" "Courage," Henrik said. "And a rowboat." The 2 men stood in the workshop as wind rattled the windows and the North Sea growled beyond the harbor walls. Above them, clouds the color of gunmetal rolled in from the west, heavy with snow that wouldn't fall for another hour. Henrik looked back at the canvas-covered rig. His illegal, dangerous, desperate attempt to reclaim the sea. The sea that had given him everything. The sea that had become a graveyard. The morning came like a bruise, dark purple fading to gray. Henrik woke at 4 a.m., though he hadn't really slept. He'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, running through the procedure in his mind. Attach the magnets. Connect the battery. Pay out the tow rope. Engage the current. Row parallel to the suspected mine field. Wait for the magnetic field to attract a mine. Wait for the explosion. Try not to die. Simple. He dressed in silence. Wool pants, heavy sweater, oilskin coat. His daughter Astrid was asleep in the next room with the children. He didn't wake her. Didn't leave a note. If this went wrong, She'd figure it out when they pulled his body from the water. The streets of Esbjerg were empty and dark. A thin layer of frost covered everything, glittering in the starlight. Henrik's breath came out in clouds as he walked to the harbor. His boots crunched on frozen gravel. Somewhere, a cat yowled. Lars was already at the pier, standing next to his rowboat, a 12-foot dinghy painted faded blue. The young man looked pale but steady. He'd brought rope, as promised. Good rope, not the frayed garbage everyone else was using. "Ready," Lars whispered. Henrik nodded. They worked quickly, loading the magnetic rig into Lars's boat. The electromagnets clinked together softly. Henrik winced at the sound, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The British patrol usually came through at dawn, but they were still an hour early. The rig was heavier than it looked. It took both men to position it carefully in the stern of the dinghy. Henrik connected the battery terminals, checking the wiring twice. His hands were steady despite the cold. Muscle memory from decades of working with fishing equipment. "How do we know it works?" Lars asked quietly. "We don't," Henrik said. "Not until we're out there." They pushed the dinghy into the water. The splash seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. Henrik climbed in first, then Lars. They each took an oar and began rowing out of the harbor, staying close to the breakwater where the shadows were deepest. The water was black and calm. Too calm. The North Sea was rarely this still, which meant a storm was coming. Henrik could feel it in his bones, the pressure change, the electric tension in the air. They had maybe 3 hours before the weather turned. 3 hours to clear a path through the mines. 3 hours to prove this wasn't just an old man's suicide mission. They rowed for 20 minutes, heading northwest toward the old fishing grounds. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness and mist. Soon there was nothing but water, black, endless, hiding thousands of tons of German explosives. Henrik checked the stolen map, using a shielded lantern. The British had marked the suspected mine locations with red XS. The nearest field started about half a mile from shore, in a channel that used to be thick with cod. "There," Henrik said, pointing. "We start there." Lars stopped rowing. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold. "This is really happening. This is really happening." Henrik moved carefully to the stern and began paying out the tow rope, 100 feet of good hemp, tied to the magnetic rig with a quick-release knot. If something went wrong, he could cut the rope and save the boat. Theoretically. The rig slid into the water with barely a splash. It floated on the surface, held up by the wooden crossbeam. Henrik fed out more rope until the rig was trailing far behind them, a dark shape bobbing in the black water. "Now we activate it," Henrik said. His hand hovered over the battery switch. This was the moment. Once he closed the circuit, the electromagnets would engage. They'd become a beacon, pulling every magnetic mine within range toward them. Pulling death toward them. Henrik thought of Astrid. Thought of his grandchildren. Thought of Stina, buried 7 years now in the cemetery above the town. She'd have told him he was an idiot. She'd have been right. He flipped the switch. Nothing happened. No sound. No visible change. But somewhere behind them, in the dark water, 2 powerful electromagnets had just activated, creating an invisible field of magnetic force. "Row," Henrik said quietly. "Slow and steady. Parallel to the coast." Lars began rowing. Henrik sat in the stern, facing backward, watching the rig. Watching the water. Watching for death. The first 15 minutes were silent except for the splash of oars and the creak of wood. The sky was starting to lighten, a thin gray line on the eastern horizon. Henrik could see the rig more clearly now, trailing behind them like a dog on a leash. The water remained calm. No explosions. Maybe there were no mines here. Maybe the British map was wrong. Maybe. The first mine surfaced 20 yards behind the rig. Henrik saw it break the water, a dark sphere covered in barnacles, trailing a length of chain. It had been pulled from the seabed by the magnetic force, drawn upward like a fish on a hook. "Lars," Henrik said quietly, "don't turn around. Keep rowing. Steady pace." "What is it?" "We found one." The mine drifted closer to the rig, pulled by the electromagnets. Henrik's heart was hammering against his ribs. He'd calculated the safe distance based on the estimated explosive yield of a standard German contact mine, about 300 pounds of TNT. 100 feet should be enough. Should be. The mine touched the rig. There was a moment, maybe half a second, where nothing happened. Henrik saw the barnacled sphere make contact with the wooden frame. Saw the magnetic trigger begin to close. Then the world turned white. The explosion was like being punched by God. A massive boom that seemed to come from inside Henrik's chest. The water behind them erupted in a column of white foam and spray that shot 50 feet into the air. The shock wave hit the dinghy like a fist, lifting the stern and nearly capsizing them. Lars shouted something Henrik couldn't hear because his ears were ringing. Water rained down on them. The dinghy rocked violently. Henrik grabbed the gunwales, his knuckles white. The tow rope went taut, then slack. For a terrible moment Henrik thought the rig was gone, blown to pieces. But when the water settled, the rig was still there. Damaged, listing to one side, but intact. The electromagnets were still in place, still drawing power from the battery. Still pulling. "Jesus Christ," Lars gasped. "Jesus fucking Christ." Henrik's ears were ringing too badly to respond. He checked himself for injuries. Everything seemed intact. The boat had taken on some water from the spray, but nothing serious. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. And the rig had worked. A second mine surfaced 30 yards away. "Henrik!" Lars shouted, pointing. Henrik saw it, another sphere, smaller than the first, but just as deadly. It was drifting toward the rig, pulled by the magnetic field. The current was carrying it faster than the first one had moved. "Keep rowing," Henrik yelled. "Get us some distance." Lars dug the oars into the water, pulling hard. The dinghy moved forward, putting more space between them and the rig. The tow rope stretched taut. The second mine hit the rig. Another explosion. This one seemed louder, closer. The water erupted again, and the shock wave slapped the dinghy sideways. Henrik heard wood crack. Somewhere in the hull, a board had split. Water began seeping in through the breach. "We're taking water," Lars shouted. "Keep rowing." A third mine surfaced. Then a fourth. The magnetic field was pulling them up from the seabed like harvesting deadly fruit. They came slowly at first, rising through the dark water, trailing chains and seaweed. Some had been down there for months. Others still had fresh German markings visible through the barnacles. The explosions came in rapid succession. Boom, boom, boom. Each one a massive hammer blow. Each one threatening to swamp the dinghy. Henrik counted them. 5, 6, 7. The water behind them was churning white, a cauldron of spray and foam. The sound was continuous now, rolling across the water like thunder. On shore, lights were coming on. Henrik could see them through the spray, windows illuminating in Esbjerg. The entire town was waking up, rushing to see what the hell was happening. Including the British. "We have to go," Lars shouted. "They'll see us." "One more pass," Henrik yelled back. "We clear this channel, the boats can get through." Lars didn't argue. He kept rowing, even as water sloshed around his ankles. Even as more mines surfaced behind them. Even as the sky grew lighter and the British patrol boat's engine could be heard starting up in the harbor. 8th mine. 9th. 10th. Each explosion shook Henrik's bones. Each one reminded him how close to death they were riding. The rig was barely holding together now. He could see pieces of wood floating in the foam. But the magnets were still working, still pulling. An 11th mine surfaced directly beneath the rig. This one didn't drift. This one was already in contact when it broke the surface. The explosion was different. Bigger. The mine must have been a newer model, packed with more explosives. The blast wave hit like a truck, and this time the dinghy did capsize. Henrik felt himself thrown into the air. The world spun. Sky, water, sky again. He hit the surface hard, the cold driving the air from his lungs. The water was black and freezing and filled with debris. He thrashed, disoriented, couldn't tell which way was up. His hand found something solid. Wood. The overturned dinghy. He broke the surface, gasping. His ears were screaming. Everything hurt. "Lars!" he shouted. "Here!" The younger man was clinging to the other side of the dinghy, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Together, they righted the boat. It was half full of water but still floating. They dragged themselves back in, coughing and shaking. The oars were gone. The rig was gone, blown to pieces by the last explosion. But the channel was clear. The British patrol boat was coming, its searchlight sweeping across the water. Henrik could hear shouting, English voices, angry and commanding. "We have to swim for it," Lars said through chattering teeth. Henrik looked at the patrol boat, then back at the shore. They were maybe 400 yards out. Too far to swim in winter water. They'd die of hypothermia before reaching the beach. "No," Henrik said. "We stay. They'll arrest us." "I know." The patrol boat pulled alongside. British sailors pointed rifles at them. An officer stood at the rail, his face purple with rage. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" the officer screamed. Henrik looked up at him, water dripping from his hair, his whole body shaking from cold and adrenaline and the knowledge of what they'd just done. "Fishing," Henrik said. "The British threw them in the brig at the naval station. Not a cell. Exactly. More like a storage room converted with an iron bar door. Cold concrete walls. A bucket in the corner. 2 wool blankets that smelled like diesel fuel." Henrik and Lars sat on the floor, still wearing their soaked clothes, watching their breath fog in the dim light. Henrik's ears were still ringing from the explosions. Everything sounded muffled, distant, like the world was speaking to him through cotton. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, whether from cold or delayed shock, he couldn't tell. Through the small window, he could see the harbor. Word had spread fast. Dozens of townspeople had gathered on the pier, watching the British patrol boats circle the area where the explosions had occurred. The water was still churning with debris, pieces of wood, chunks of mine casing, dead fish floating belly up from the concussion. "We're fucked," Lars said quietly. His forehead had stopped bleeding, but the cut looked nasty. "They're going to make an example of us." Henrik didn't answer. He was thinking about the count. 11 explosions. 11 mines cleared from that channel. The old cod route was open now, or at least safer than it had been. Not perfect, but fishable. The door at the end of the corridor clanged open. Footsteps approached, hard military boots on concrete. Henrik looked up to see the British officer from the patrol boat, accompanied by 2 armed guards. The officer was in his 40s, lean and severe, with a mustache that looked like it had been drawn on with a ruler. Commander James Whitmore, according to the name tag on his uniform. Whitmore stood outside the bars, studying them like specimens in a jar. His jaw was clenched so tight Henrik thought he might crack his own teeth. 11 mines, Whitmore said finally. His voice was clipped, furious. "You detonated 11 German mines using an unlicensed magnetic device in waters under Royal Navy jurisdiction." Henrik met his eyes. Said nothing. Do you have any fucking idea, what you could have done? Whitmore's voice rose. You could have triggered a chain reaction. You could have destroyed the harbor. You could have killed hundreds of people. But we didn't, Henrik said quietly. Whitmore's face went even more purple. You got lucky, you stupid old man. Those were contact mines. You had no idea how they were positioned, what their yield was, whether they were clustered. He stopped, taking a breath to control himself. You could have been blown to atoms. We knew the risks. Did you? Whitmore stepped closer to the bars. Did you know that mine number 7 was within 30 feet of an undersea telegraph cable? Did you know that mine number 9 was sitting on top of an unexploded German bomb from 1944? No. Because we fucking did. We've been mapping these fields for months, planning the safest clearance routes, and you just... He slammed his hand against the bars. You just towed a fucking magnet through it like you were fishing for mackerel. Lars flinched. Henrik remained still. We cleared a path, Henrik said. That channel is fishable now. That channel is still a fucking minefield. Whitmore shouted. You cleared one narrow corridor. There are hundreds more mines in those waters. Thousands, probably. And now every desperate fisherman with a magnet and a death wish is going to try the same idiotic stunt. Henrik hadn't thought of that. The realization hit him like cold water. Of course they would. Half of Esbjerg had probably watched the explosions. They'd seen the rig work. They'd seen 2 men survive. How long? Henrik asked. What? How long until the Navy clears all the mines? The real number, not the official estimate. Whitmore's jaw worked. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, 4 years. Maybe 5. We don't have enough ships. Demoning isn't a priority anymore. The war's over. Most of our resources are going to the Pacific Theater or reconstruction. 4 years, Henrik repeated. My grandchildren will be dead in 4 years. That's not my problem. It is now. Whitmore stared at him. Something shifted in the officer's eyes. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. The recognition of an impossible situation with no good solutions. You're looking at 6 months in prison, Whitmore said finally. Both of you. Illegal demoning operations. Destruction of government property. Reckless endangerment. And that's if we're feeling generous. What's the other option? Henrik asked. There is no other option. Yes, there is. Whitmore frowned. Explain. Henrik stood up slowly, joints cracking. He walked to the bars, gripping the cold iron. Outside, more people were gathering on the pier. He could see fishing boats at anchor, idle, useless, gathering barnacles. You said you don't have enough ships, Henrik said. Don't have enough resources. The mines are going to sit there for years while people starve. Get to the point. Use us. Whitmore blinked. What? Use us, Henrik repeated. We know these waters better than any British sailor. We know the currents, the depths, the channels. We can clear the mines faster than your minesweepers because we're desperate enough to take the risks you can't. That's insane. Is it? Henrik leaned closer. You have 1 minesweeper working this coast. 1. It clears maybe 3 mines a day, on a good day. We cleared 11 in 20 minutes. And nearly killed yourselves doing it. We're willing to take that chance. Others will be too. Whitmore shook his head. I will not, sanction civilian demoning operations. It goes against every regulation, every safety protocol. Your protocols don't feed children. The words hung in the cold air. Whitmore's expression hardened, but Henrik saw something flicker behind it. The officer turned away, pacing in the narrow corridor. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with shaking hands. "Even if I wanted to authorize this," Whitmore said quietly, "which I don't, my superiors would never allow it. The Admiralty would have my commission." "Then don't tell them." Whitmore spun around. "What?" "Don't tell them," Henrik said again. "Look the other way. We'll work at night, stay out of your official search grids. You pretend we don't exist. We clear the mines. Everyone wins." "Everyone dies, you mean?" "Some of us, probably. But we're dying anyway. At least this way we die trying." Whitmore smoked in silence, studying Henrik through the bars. The older man's face was weathered and hard, carved by decades of North Sea winters. His eyes held no fear, only calculation. "You're serious," Whitmore said finally. "Dead serious. You understand I could hang you right now? Technically, this is sabotage during a time of military occupation. The war's been over for 8 months. Technically." Henrik smiled grimly. "Then technically hang me. Or technically let me save my town." Whitmore finished his cigarette, grinding it under his boot. He looked at Lars, who'd been silent through the entire exchange. "What about you?" Whitmore asked. "You willing to die for this old man's crazy plan?" Lars stood up. His legs were unsteady, but his voice wasn't. "I already watched my brother die because of German mines. I'd rather die clearing them than starve watching my kids waste away." Whitmore closed his eyes. Henrik saw the conflict playing across the officer's face. Duty versus humanity, regulations versus reality. The British had a reputation for following rules, but they also had a reputation for pragmatism. Finally, Whitmore opened his eyes. "I never had this conversation," he said quietly. "I never saw your magnetic rig. As far as I'm concerned, those 11 mines detonated spontaneously due to corrosion of their trigger mechanisms." Henrik felt something release in his chest. "And us. You were fishing. Illegally, in prohibited waters. I'm giving you a warning and releasing you." Whitmore turned to one of the guards. "Let them out." The guard unlocked the door. Henrik and Lars stepped into the corridor, hardly believing it. "But," Whitmore continued, his voice hard, "if you do this, if you continue this insanity, you follow rules." "My rules?" "What rules?" "1. You work only in areas I designate. I'll mark safe corridors on maps I'll leave at the harbormaster's office. 2. You work at dawn or dusk only, when my patrols aren't active. 3. You notify me of every clearance operation 24 hours in advance. 4. You train others properly. No amateurs blowing themselves up because they saw you get lucky." Henrik nodded. "Agreed." "And 5, Whitmore stepped close, his face inches from Henrik's. "You don't get to die, old man. You trained for this in the Merchant Marine. You know explosives. Which means you're responsible for every fisherman who follows your example. Their blood is on your hands. Understood?" Whitmore stepped back. "Get out of here before I change my mind." Henrik and Lars walked down the corridor, past the guards, out into the cold morning air. The sun was fully up now, pale and weak behind winter clouds. The crowd on the pier had grown larger. Henrik could see faces he recognized. Fishermen. Their families. People who'd been watching from shore, who'd seen the explosions, who'd understood what they meant. As Henrik walked toward the pier, the crowd parted. Someone handed him a dry coat. Someone else pressed a flask of whiskey into his hand. Lars was surrounded by people checking his injury, wrapping his head in clean bandages. An old woman, Mrs. Halvorsen, who'd lost her husband to a mine in November, grabbed Henrik's hand. "You cleared the channel," she whispered. "My son can fish again." Henrik couldn't speak. He just nodded. From the naval station, Whitmore watched through a window. He saw the crowd gathering around the two fishermen. Saw the hope spreading like fire. He took out another cigarette and lit it, his hands still shaking. "Sir," one of the guards approached. "Should I file a report on the incident?" Whitmore took a long drag. "What incident?" The unauthorized demoning operation, sir." "I saw no unauthorized operation, sailor. Just some old mines finally corroding through and detonating. Happens all the time in these waters. Log it as a natural occurrence." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Whitmore went back to watching the crowd. He was violating a dozen regulations. Could lose his commission. Could face court-martial. But he was also thinking about the last report he'd sent to London, the one asking for more resources, more ships, more personnel to clear the Danish coast. The response had been a polite version of "not a priority." The fishermen were making it a priority. Let them, Whitmore thought. Let them risk their lives for their homes. At least someone gave a damn. Henrik stood on the pier as snow began to fall, light flakes that melted on contact with the water. Lars was beside him, his head wrapped in bandages, grinning despite everything. "What now?" Lars asked. Henrik looked out at the harbor, at the fishing boats, at the sea that had been forbidden for so long. "Now," Henrik said, "we build more rigs. And we train others." "How many others?" Henrik smiled. It was a hard smile, the kind worn by men who'd accepted their own deaths and decided to make them count. "All of them," he said.